Dean.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah. So tell me about you and your role at Rebranding, and it was just so great to have the conversation with you a few weeks ago. And you were telling me your story, and I was like, oh my gosh, can we capture that on a conversation? And so, Miguel, yeah, please tell us about your role and your journey, and a little bit about you personally as well would be great.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot there to unpack. So, well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. So, I'm the head of corporate affairs, but I'm also the chief sustainability officer at our newly rebranded Reckitt.
And congratulations, you did that yesterday, right?
We rebranded ourselves last week. And the big news of yesterday was we announced our new sustainability ambitions for the business yesterday. So there's a lot of things happening, a lot of moving pieces. So I report to our global CEO, to Lakshman Narasimhan. I sit on the Reckitt executive team. Which is a great place to be. It's a great vantage point to be because, I see myself as very much core to how we develop our business strategy as a whole, and what we do to build our corporate reputation is increasingly important to everyone. So, I think it's right. It feels right and feels great to be part of that broader leadership team.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, I think I've now just had my 4th anniversary at Reckitt, and before that, I was for a little while I was the chief communications officer at the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Okay. But I spent quite a lot of my career at Unilever, where I was there for just under 14 or 15 years, and was their head of external, what we called external affairs and sustainability while I was there. So, most of my career has been either on that sort of corporate comms, but increasingly sustainability has been a sort of an integral part of my day job, certainly for the last 15 or more years.
So that's really interesting that you came from a comms background and a corporate affairs background, and then this is now sustainability is sort of elevated you to really the C-suite level and the board level to be quite a strong part of the DNA of the business, right? And so what's that transition been like for you, and what was the pivotal point where Reckitt said, right, we're going to make sustainability core to our business model?
Okay, so if I go back a second, I think, increasingly, if you see if I look at what most communications or corporate affairs people try and do, it's storytell.
Yes.
And the ability of an organization to tell its story and how effectively it tells its story is increasingly important. It's increasingly important to attract talent, to retain talent, to be able to partner with people, because people want to partner with organizations and companies that they know and trust and they're familiar with. It's super important for your relationships with other key stakeholders like governments, for example, because in many instances, we're in a heavily, increasingly regulated sector. Absolutely. In consumer health. But also investors, because a lot of what investors get is they often hear about or see or read about you externally as well. It's not just about what they see when they talk to you, but it's often what they hear from others outside. So storytelling is at the heart of it. But for me, therefore, what it is that, the story that you want to tell is increasingly intrinsically linked with the corporate purpose, what the company exists to do, what it stands for, what it speaks to. And that is rooted very much in its approach to its impact on society. And the impact on society is essentially your sustainability ambitions. And I have been very careful not to use the word sustainability strategy, because I actually think there's only one strategy of a company. You might see it as a business strategy, but in fact, there is one strategy, and how sustainability plays its part within that is an integral element of it, but it's not distinct from it.
I love that you've done that, because a lot of corporates have put sustainability strategy either to one side, it's separate to the commercial strategy, or it's, you know, CSR reporting on the other, you know, that's left separate from the financial reporting, etc. So I love that you've kind of said, no, it's the strategy of the business, and sustainability has a part to play in that. And
yeah. And by the way, I was going to just say one thing about that, because I think that you said a few words a few minutes ago. You said, listen, why did Reckitt decide to do this? What was it? Well, actually, I came to Reckitt on the understanding that that was the job I was going to take. Some of it, therefore, starts with leaders, individuals, new leadership, and people coming in with fresh perspectives. Yes. But the other piece of it is just that understanding that for many years, you know, Reckitt, if you associated it with anything, it was seen to be a high-performing shareholder brand, virtually invisible with many other stakeholders, and therefore there was a sort of understanding that for the company to continue to grow. And we talk a lot about medium-term to long-term sustainable growth, encapsulated within that notion of sustainable growth.
Yes,
is this idea that your responsibility as a business is increasingly seen through the lens of different stakeholders, multiple stakeholders that you have to serve the needs of.
That's right.
And you know, for us, it starts first and foremost with our own people. But it's about our customers and our consumers being at the heart of everything. We have to be, you know, customer and consumer obsessed if we're going to be successful.
Yeah.
And the desires and the needs and the aspirations of those consumers and customers is changing as well. And they're increasingly asking companies to do more and to stand up and say more, just as like an employee is. So it's not necessarily that somebody you know, someone sat there and thought, oh gosh, let's just pivot in a new direction. No, I think the signals were all there.
Yeah.
And people are understanding that this is the future direction of business if you want to remain a successful business in the long term.
Absolutely. No, that's exactly right. And so when we met, one of the things that I thought was brilliant about just the role that you took and the steps that you took, I thought, like, for when I speak to companies, even if they have like sustainability believers and they've seen the signs that they know this is the new currency for, you know, attracting better valuations and market share and you know, trust with their employees and their clients, it's usually like the how do I, well then where do I start? How do I get going? What are the building blocks for aligning sustainability deep into the heart of the business strategy? And can you just share some of like what you did and your process that you went through? Because I know that was like really foundational and breakthrough of the building blocks you built before launching your strategy yesterday.
Well, look, I think first and foremost, I don't think we're as a company, as Reckitt, I think I say this with a lot of humility, because I don't think we're a leader, certainly not yet. I think we're going on the same journey that many other companies are going on.
Yeah.
But what it started with, as I said, it was that realization and that recognition that that sat inside the organization, that if we wanted to succeed, that doing more, recognizing our role in the world is changing and we have to change with it. Yeah. And that this was actually a growth driver, not something that we did because we had to comply with the law, legally, you know, legal compliance being one of the critical things that often gets cited, or because it was, you know, trying to demonstrate we were a good citizen, which often gets translated into corporate philanthropy. No, this was actually going to be a critical element of our growth.
Yeah.
Now, when you start with that, then again, the question is, what level of ambition should you have? And what can you actually affect? What change can you affect? So there's a whole series of processes that you have to go through. You have to look at the materiality of your business.
Absolutely.
You have to understand what your strategic intent is. You know, which categories are you operating in? What's your business footprint look like? Where do you see it going to and evolving? And what do you see it evolving into? You need to understand what those externalities are in terms of the trends that are happening and how those trends are often moving at pace. I mean, if you had asked us all 2 years ago to name the sort of top priority issues that, you know, business was going to be confronted with, probably COVID would not have been on that list. And public health would not have risen to the top. Probably diversity and inclusion wouldn't have either. And yet here we are 2 years later, and all of those issues, including climate change, which I think fell off the corporate agenda for quite a long time, are firmly within the, you know, every company understands that these are all issues that we have to address at a strategic level inside the organization. So I think you have to go through that process, and then you have to engage your senior leadership in that conversation, because the solutions are multi-dimensional, they're multifunctional. And you can't address something through a value chain as well without acknowledging that it's not just your own footprint that you have to think about, but the upstream and the downstream. And that also means that you've got to start thinking a lot more about your way of collaborating and partnering. So when you're doing your evaluation, you have to think about, well, what's the capacity or the capabilities of people who are part of my value chain, part of my supply chain, you know, raw materials suppliers, R&D partners, people who are actually going to be, you know, bringing the solutions that you need. Well, are they the right partners? Do you have them? In fact, do you even treat them as partners? Because often they've been quite tactical relationships. So I think a lot of it sits with doing your homework and really understanding it and spending the time as a senior leadership of the organization, looking across it and trying to understand what it is that you can actually bring to bear. And when you've done all of that, and then you've identified some of the areas of focus, you've then got to make some choices, and you've got to start to cost those. You've got to think about, what does it mean if we're going to invest in these areas, over what time frame, and you've also got to think about how you're going to operationalize it. So this is the third big component, which is, do you have the right governance processes in place? Do you have the right measurement tools and capabilities to be able to take you know, decisions and make decisions based on some of the data points that you need to be able to do that? So this is kind of rewriting the rule book, if you like, of what it means to do business. It's adding another dimension to it. And I think in some cases, you know, particularly in the environmental space, a huge amount of progress has been made on that in the last 10 years or more. I think what's really the new space is in the social area, the social pillar, and companies trying to really understand what it is that they can do, and what are the right kind of metrics and the right kind of KPIs that you should be setting for yourself inside the organization. So that's kind of the journey we've been on. And the ambitions, as we describe them, we talk about for our cleaner, healthier world ambitions, because our corporate purpose speaks to creating a cleaner, healthier world. If you really look at that, that's just an expression of the intent. It's the impact we want to have on the world, the societal impact that we want to hold ourselves accountable for. But as I said, that's kind of the thing we talk about, but there's a huge amount that you have to have built into the system before that. And so we've spent literally the last 18 months preparing for what we've just announced.
Wow. And so in terms of, so you went through that process, and let's just say, you know, one of the things that we're seeing also is just companies thinking, oh, do I have to spend like the 18 months, kind of get my house in order and then get going? Because like, I'm also championing another movement, which is that leadership doesn't mean you've got your house in order and you're then coming out of the gate saying, hey, look, this is what we're doing. I think leadership for me is courage and vulnerability. And I liked how you said, look, we're not a leader yet, but we are making a start and we're showing a trajectory for this. And so, what's your advice to other chief sustainability officers or even smaller companies that don't even have a sustainability person in their team? How can they sort of streamline this? They can't afford a third-party consultancy or someone to come in and do the whole kind of mapping for them and the purpose. What's your advice? Is it like, get going, start small, work out what's...
I was going to say exactly, you take the words right out of my mouth. Look, I don't think you need to have a sustainability I mean, this is something which large companies, in a sense, have evolved into. But in many ways, the ownership sits with everyone. It doesn't.
Yes.
If you're doing this right, the worry in some ways is having people like me often has gravitationally meant that people just assume that sustainability sits in a box in a corner, and that obviates the responsibility for other people to take accountability or responsibility for doing the right thing, right? And it's not true. I mean, if you are an HR leader of a business, you don't need a sustainability person to tell you that you need to think about how you're going to build a more diverse and inclusive organization is going to be key to your future growth. You can work that one out for yourself. Now you have to think about what's the right way to do that. And but often people who are part of HR communities are also part of HR networks, and there's a lot you can learn from your peers and talking to others who are doing it. You don't necessarily have to hire a consultant to teach you the ropes. So a lot of it starts with taking personal ownership and accountability for what you think needs to happen. Where it obviously gets more difficult is when you're straddling across different pieces of the business, and that's where in many ways what we try and do is be a bit like the glue that holds it all together. That's what the sustainability team is really doing, is they're helping the business to look through the silos, to break through the silos and look across. And in many ways the corporate communications people are telling the story across as well. So this is the link. It's you want to tell the entire story. Our product brands will, engage on one thing with a consumer, but collectively we tell the corporate story of Reckitt, and that's essentially what we're trying to do, is be the glue or join up all the dots, whichever analogy you want to have. But if you're a CFO or you're looking at this, if you're a supply chain lead in a business, you can start looking at your upstream supply chains and saying, are we working with the right co-packers? Are we working with the right raw material suppliers? Can I figure out ways of working with them in ways that can improve not just our partnership, but we can start to deal with some of the tough nut issues that we know we have to deal with. Otherwise, I'm either going to help, that's going to help me de-risk my business a bit. I'm not going to get caught in a crossfire if something is happening up at the top of my supply chain with modern slavery, or I've got some issues of environmental health and safety, or something happens that's going to compromise that relationship. You can do that, and in fact you can initiate that fairly simply, and there are some simple steps for it. But as I say, what helps is if you have a CEO or a leader of the business that can also force those conversations to happen collectively. It shouldn't just be one leader of an in one part of the business that feels like this is their thing and they're going to champion it. You really need a CEO, I think, who can actually become the person who, in a sense, drives that integration and creates that sense of shared ownership. And the best way to try and deliver that is to agree 2 or 3 common targets. If you're trying to figure out what to do, start with some very simple actions that you can all own together, and start there and hold yourself accountable for those 2 or 3 things happening. And you know what? That's enough to start the ball rolling.
I agree with you. And even the sustainable development goals are very now well defined, where you can say, okay, these are material to my sector, these SDGs, and we're going to, take 2 or 3 of them and work through those and say, how could we best contribute to those SDGs, for example.
And that's absolutely right. You have to start with, firstly, you have to understand the footprint of your own business. What are the things that you do that have some impact, either on the environment or on people. It's as simple as that. And by the way, the other pillar is economic, because the things that you contribute can be job creating or wealth creating, enabling. You can create jobs, you can skill, train. These are all positive contributions to society. They're not necessarily just purely about climate change, or often the social pillar people kind of associate with issues like human rights and respecting human rights, but there's a definite amount of tax that you contribute. All of these things are part of your net contribution. So you sort of start with what is that footprint, and then, as you rightly say, you layer on top of that what are the things like in many ways the sustainable development goals are a useful reference, because they're the only game in town really as a kind of global to-do list. I mean, it's like a giant kind of to-do list for the world, and you can pick on those that you think you can have the biggest influence on, and say, well, actually, if I could do one thing well, it's to do X, which will contribute to addressing that big societal need. But if I'm going to do that, I can only succeed, probably be better at it, if I can figure out who else I could partner with on that. And sometimes that might be a customer, or it could be a supplier, or it could even be a competitor, peer-to-peer. You can have conversations with some other companies, because some of this stuff is not really competitive. It's pre-competitive. It's not even, it's just stuff that everybody's challenged by. And some ways that's why, talking to some of your peers and going, what, we all need to figure this one out. So wouldn't it make sense to figure this out together is often the right way to go as well.
So we also talk about, in fact, we use these values to underpin the platform. It's a bit of an algorithm that I use as well, is that it starts, number one, with transparency, right? So once you've defined your purpose, then you really do need to look at yourself and get your own version of your truth first, right? You've got to say, okay, where are we? Where are we? Where's our footprint? Where can we make the biggest difference? Where are we today? And where are our risks and where are opportunities, right? So it starts with that level of transparency. Once you get that, it unlocks, I believe, trust. And once you unlock trust with your different stakeholders, then you unlock partnership. Because what we don't want to also see is businesses trying to be like charities, or charities trying to be like governments, or governments trying to be like businesses, right? Actually, we've all got our part to play, and we've all got to play to our strengths. And so we really feel like the SDGs A Game is a universal framework that allows us to all play to our strengths collectively in partnership. And then from
Goal 17 is exactly that. It's about partnering in new ways, radically different ways.
And then from there, you achieve the most holistic outcomes, so that's kind of my mantra, really. And we've underpinned the values of transparency to unlock trust, trust to unlock partnership, partnership to unlock the most holistic outcomes. And so and then so if you get there, you go, okay, right, I've worked out my purpose. We've made some goals now that we're going to target, and we've realized what we're going to do as a business. I want to talk about measurement now, because I think this is then where things also come off the rails a little bit, because I think people can get to making statements saying, on their sustainability report or their website or their press releases or whatever. And then measuring, you used a really good word, accountability towards then the targets that you've set. And when I've been talking to a lot of the investor community, who, as you know, are now this is a huge, huge topic for them, right? So they are wanting to know probably more the sustainability credentials of a company than its financial credentials right now. They really want to understand that at depth. And when we're speaking to them, you know, they were saying that actually the data that they get is mainly like ESG ratings, right? Is a company good, bad, not so good? And there's quite a discrepancy between same company, one's getting a D from somewhere, one's getting an A++, and there's this huge kind of divide going on at the moment. And so this is the feedback I've received from them, is to say, well, actually what we want as investors, and I think all stakeholders want for decision making, is impact measurement, right? We wanted to know if we invest in this product or this solution or this company or this project, are we going to move the dial from here to here in that strategy? Tell me what your views are on this whole thing around measuring and tracking performance against those targets.
Okay, there's a, well, again, a big, I agree with everything you've said, so not anything there really to dispute. I would say to you though that I like your reflection on, you know, purpose, and I started trying to explain that in many ways materiality, what you're asking yourself is, why do you exist? At your very core, you know, why am I here? What do I do? And where do I have an impact? I mean, that's your starting point. And as you rightly say, then once you understand what that is, then you can express that in ways that make sense to you and feel relevant and authentic and not just kind of manufactured. Then it's about, well, what impact do I think I can have, and then how do I quantify that in real terms, in measurable terms? And as I was trying to allude, in some spaces there's a lot of you know, the data and the modeling and the analytics and the data gathering is so much more sophisticated, and that's because we've spent a lot of time, particularly over the last decade or more, in the environmental area at being very astute, well, not astute, but it's become kind of common. There are common frameworks around which most companies are working, and so it's easier. The place that's more difficult is in this social pillar, as you start to talk about, you know, what does it truly mean to, you know, treat people fairly, or when you start to look at you know, being a diverse business, what does that mean, and what kind of metrics can you apply? And in fact, do those metrics in many ways have perverse effects and actually drive things that you don't want to happen into the business? And so that's a place which is fast evolving, and there's still quite a lot of variance and differences between what companies report, how they report it. And indeed, as you say, there are multiple indices out there at the moment on which people are assessed. And actually, what I think is going to happen over time is some degree of consolidation. I just think it's just a natural trend.
Agreed.
Is that we're just going to have to see some form of consolidation of the data and the systems that, you know, the scoring and the methodologies have to start to become more consistent, more coherent, more benchmarkable, so that you can actually compare apples with apples and not be comparing very different businesses based on completely different metrics and trying to make sense of it, because that's a little bit of where we are when we look at some of this. So what you're doing is you're getting a lot of indicative data. You're not getting, it's indicative of intent, or it's indicative of direction of travel, but it's not robust in the same way that your financial data would be. And it's not necessarily comparable because you're not using the same methodology for calculating it. And so that's why it gets a little bit more difficult to do. But for saying all of it, I think, and all of that, I think it is clear that the solution often then comes back to how have you built trust with that community of investors? And that comes back to transparency, because what the investors are looking for is data, but they also just want transparent access to information. And at the heart of it is, do they believe that they can trust you? because it's so hard to form an opinion based on all of the various multiple indicators at the end. At the end of the day, it is about a trusted relationship. And so I think some of that's built through dialogue and interaction, which is what we're spending more time doing now. And but some of it will, over time, mature. I mean, we're just going to be much more mature about this. I think there's probably a period of another 5 or 10 years before we'll have a truly mature system, but nevertheless, we're on the journey towards that more integrated and mature reporting and measurement systems being implemented. What I talk a lot about is this currency of trust, because you know, every company, it doesn't matter which company you're talking about, will do certain things well and other things less well. It will be a leader in certain areas, and it will, in some cases, potentially be a laggard in others. It's not, there's no universal, you can't outperform on every metric on everything. No. And I think, you know, this is one of the other challenges that we all face, which is, you know, that often you're sort of judged on the thing that you've been poorest at, and not necessarily at the thing that all the other things that actually you're doing well. The bias is still towards the
naming and shaming.
And so how do you frame this over time so people understand that, you know, and every company faces its challenges. Every company will do things well and some things less well.
Right.
It's about consistency, and it's about how that company seeks to find resolution to those issues, and what systems and governance does it have in place, which is why it is an ESG conversation. Yeah. It's about what are you doing to de-risk that, you know, reduce the risk that happens, and then what actions are you taking, what governance and oversight instruments do you have in place and mechanisms do you have in place. So if something happens, you're actually addressing it in the most responsible way. And I think that's really important, because otherwise you get driven a lot by headlines. You know, it's happened, and that, you know, automatically all your scores drop. And in some ways it's a kind of a blunderbuss. You know, it's not always a great way necessarily of judging an overall performance.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we're, again, sort of trying to spearhead in the next frontier of this is what I was calling before, you know, integrated reporting, where the financial and the non-financial come together. And that even instead of ESG, which still separates the financial from the non-financial, we're talking about C, which is social, economic, and environmental. Actually starting with people first. If you educate people, if you reward people for the good behavior, if you start to heal yourself, you heal the planet, right? So actually social is kind of the starting blocks, which you alluded to before. That then also starts to impact on the economic. The economic then starts to impact on the environmental. And actually that's true of us as individuals or organizations or cities or nations, right? It's the same thing, is that you start, you know, with looking inside, you sort that bit out first, and then the economic sorts itself out, and so does the environmental. And so when we talk about impact measurement and sustainable development, we talk about, a lot of people don't know this, but it's the theory of change, isn't it, that you've been talking about as well, the input, output, outcome, impact. Exactly. So a lot of companies are at the input level. They're measuring how much are they investing, what are they doing, what policies do they have, etc. And actually, what we need to be looking at is what's the output of that. But then once you track the output, what's the outcome of doing those activities, right? And those outcomes then have an impact. They can have a positive or a negative impact.
And
right?
Indeed, and look, if you're honest about it, I mean, you know, when we talk about something like climate change, and we talk about, you know, the commitments that many companies are making to net zero, the reason why there are still some differences between what a company commits to do for itself and then, you know, in so-called scope 1, scope 2. emissions, which is again a very technical term for what you do in your value chain upstream and in your factories and so on, is because when you start addressing things like the product through the life cycle of how you decarbonize a product, quite quickly you're taken immediately to how the product is used, because a very large piece of that equation is in the way that the person who purchases it uses it. In that, do they take a, do they use it? Do they overdose? If you're putting it in a dishwasher, you put in 2 tabs when you should put in 1. Are you using the eco button or not using the eco button? All of those things have a bearing on the amount of embedded carbon that you are looking to measure. And then, of course, you have the end of life and what happens to it at the end of life. And often so much of that is determined by the choices that the person who bought it makes. If, am I going to recycle that or not? Am I going to reuse it or not? What am I doing towards changing my behavior? So a lot of it actually gets quite difficult, because now you say, well, there's an output, yes, but the impact is variable because it depends on the behavior of the individuals that use it to determine what that is. Now, if you then want to have credible data and data systems that you can stand behind and say, well, that is the overall impact, it's hard to do. So everybody is trying to navigate that at the moment. We're trying to come up with the ways to both model that and ways in which we can measure it. But at the fundamental starting point of it is, you have to rethink what it means to market a product, because within that, historically, it was a very linear construct where the company sold the product or transferred the product to the customer. It could be a retail customer, and that sort of all the responsibilities kind of stopped there. But now, of course, if you're seeing it through that through that life cycle and through that extended value chain, what you now have to think about is how you engage and how you start to influence both awareness, because if no one's aware of what matters, they won't take any action.
Correct.
To encouraging people to care enough to want to take action, because to be honest, it's not immediately clear that if you just are made aware of something, that automatically means you're going to take an act and do something differently. No, you have to actually create a sense of engagement and ownership. So people have to feel like this is something that matters to them.
Exactly.
Then they take an action. But then the question that's even the bigger challenge is that action has to become systematic. It has to become constant and consistent. You can't just see somebody doing it for once or twice and then reverting back to their previous behaviors because we make it too difficult, or it just becomes too, because they sort of disengage. So somehow figuring that all out, that's what we're talking about. So when you say you're having a conversation about scope 3, or you're having a conversation about decarbonization through the life cycle, at the heart of it is that, and therefore where and how you measure impact, when you start to take it down the line, all the way down to that end of line, that's the hard thing that we're getting to grips with. And there's no simple solution right now, which is why we're taking a view that we have that ambition to be net zero by 2040 right now, because we think it's going to take us a while. And by the way, you have to re-innovate your entire business model to be able to deliver against that. So this all, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it, and it doesn't mean we don't need to accelerate it. It just means that when you look at how you build the systems that support that, and then clearly how are you going to measure this in a way that is truly robust and accurate, that's the other piece of the jigsaw that we're still figuring out.
Yeah, and I think that's where people's brain starts to you know,
Yeah,
I need like a PhD.
Tough, right?
Right?
Like, oh my gosh, can we do this? Well,
Like seriously, and that's what's freaking people out, right? And I think that's really where we, you know, as the founder of this platform, I really wanted to try and talk about simple because we're using technology to do a lot of this stuff to standardize and streamline the reporting, but simple because we talk about the acronym strategic, interconnected, meaningful, purpose-driven, long-term, educative, you know, do what counts, do what matters, measure what's, you know, important, because it's really hard. It is really, really hard. But I think back to the SDGs, there's actually a natural inbuilt theory of change in the SDGs. So if you imagine that your input layer is your product, your service, your operations, your policies, and your human capital. If you think about at the survey level, like for example, an SDG survey that we've created, that's capturing your output level, how much, when, you know, the real output sort of activities. And then you've got that mapped to the SDG target level, which is the outcomes we want to see. And the targets are mapped to the goal level, which is the impact we want to see. Actually, so it gives you a strategy tool to say, actually, if we do these things, we are going to affect these outcomes. And we are then going to affect these impacts of 17 goals.
Completely. And by the way, this is this can be really inspirational for people who are working in companies and with brands, in our case. This is the thing that can actually make a huge difference to motivating and accelerating change, is that people can see it because it feels tangible. And you know, so what we're doing is, in our case, we're looking at every one of our major brands, our major global brands, each tying their purpose, their brand purpose, and aligning that to an SDG and to a series of SDG outcomes, because sometimes it's more than one.
Yes.
And trying to see what when they start to look at then the impact that they want to have, they link it back to those bigger societal impacts. And what we're saying at the corporate level, which is what if you look at our sustainability ambitions, if you look at what we think is the biggest disruptive impact that we can have, it's the cumulative and collective impact of all of those brands together.
That's right.
Yeah. Taking you know, what they do and driving that. And so in some ways, you know, just making those products available is in a way driving positive societal impact. And so, you know, this is actually kind of core to then our growth ambitions, because it's the driver of our business growth as much as it is of the societal impact that we want to have.
That's awesome. And actually, as you said, you know, we talked about the interconnectedness of the SDGs. It's actually your collective brands could be targeting certain SDGs and targets, but they're all interconnected. So if you pull on one lever, you indirectly and directly connect to other SDGs at the same time. And so that's the power of something that is social, economic, and environmental all working together, because they do have different, one lever pulls another lever and increases that indirect and direct impact. So, which is also powerful, rather than a checklist that you're working towards. Actually, you really want to make sure what you're doing gives you as much bang for your buck as possible.
Couldn't agree more.
So, any final thoughts in terms of, you know, this next season that you've launched the strategy, you're making the claims, you're going to be measuring it, and where, you know, what do you think is the future of business now in a role to play as we build back better post COVID? What's your hope for this next era for us as the 21st century generation?
Oh gosh, that's a huge question. I just hope I can do it justice. I'm not sure I can. You know, we let's just be clear. I mean, you know, we're still in a COVID pandemic. Many parts of the world are likely to be impacted by this for at least another 2 years. You know, whatever we may all think, you know, as we get vaccinated, if we have this view that somehow we will go back to normal, I'm not sure that's true. No. I think the world has gravitationally changed as a consequence of this, and I think it's also created a lot of moments of introspection and self-reflection at a personal level for many people. Absolutely. And in some ways, it's been incredibly challenging. But it's also given people a new perspective, a new outlook on what they want to get from their lives and the way they want to lead their lives. So I think this is one of those moments, those big seminal moments of change, which I think we should just understand is the new reality. Yeah. For companies like ours, obviously, we're a consumer health and hygiene company as well as a nutrition company. And so, you know, our biggest challenge for the last year has just been to meet the demand, the unmet needs of so many people. And actually, I think this nexus between, you know, public health and things like future pandemics and risks, you know, basic hygiene and sanitation and all these things are going to remain absolutely important if we're going, and things that we still need to invest in if we're going to be able to avoid future risks and future pandemics, and indeed a future, you know, we don't want the COVID to come back again. If we're able to contain it, it will certainly mean that we have to remain vigilant, and we have to ensure that hygiene stays at the front and center of people's minds. And obviously that overlap between, you know, zoological and biodiversity loss and impacts with climate change, these are all integrated things. So from our point of view, a lot of change will impact our business going forwards. In fact, we talk about these 5 big mega trends that drive everything that our business will do over the coming years. And at the heart of it, one of them is this issue of both climate change, urbanization, and this link to public health and climate change. I think if you are saying to me, what do I think are sort of some of the challenges or the issues, I think we've touched on a lot of things in this last 10 or 15 minutes of conversation, or 20 minutes of conversation we've had together. There are big questions about the role that business plays in society, heightened expectations as a result of what's happened with the pandemic. Companies increasingly looked at by their employees as the primary source often of information. Their heightened expectations of the employee for what the company needs to do for them, for their well-being, for their mental resilience, for their, you know, and that's going to continue. This need to be recognizing the importance of being more inclusive, more diverse, addressing some of these big inequities. That's again something that business is going to have to address. Unlike the previous period of economic downturn and recession, where in effect we parked the bus on climate change and we sort of ran away and said it was all about the economy, stupid. The opposite is happening. People are saying, actually, now we need to take more action. We do need to do it faster, and we're going to expect it of companies, and they need to step up and take ownership of this. And that's exactly why we made the announcement we did yesterday, that we're going to be one of the partners for the coming COP26 climate summit. And we're going to be the hygiene partner, because we're going to be the partner that tries to help the government to keep it a safe COP. We want people to be hygienically safe and protected during that very important process of negotiation for the world. And so I think, you know, businesses' expectations are heightening, which means that this is an area where, in terms of the impact you have on the world, it's going to become more and more important. And it's going to become more important to recruiting people, keeping people with you, all those other things we talked about. And that gets built around openness, transparency, honesty, storytelling. It links to then being able to, within that, is to operationalize things into your core business. You can't just tell the story, you have to take action. And taking action means you have to build the systems and the processes and the governance and the oversight and the measurement in order for that to become a reality. So the big focus in the next 2 or 3 years is how are we going to build the operational frameworks to enable all of this?
Yeah.
And then as we action it, it's back to the last topic we just talked about, which is how are we going to be able to measure and report against that, and acknowledge that in some cases there are going to be some gaps and deficiencies, and we've still got to, you know, learn our way into some of this. But the path is pretty clear. That's the path that we're all on. And I think the companies that make those transitions and put their effort into doing it, even if they don't get it right 100% of the time, I think we'll still be here in the coming, you know, decade and beyond. And those that don't, I think at some stage are going to find it harder, and probably in some cases will not be there in the next decade.
So is your punchline for those CEOs and boards sitting around the world at the moment going, yeah, I don't know if sustainability is going to be a thing and we can kind of do business as usual? Are you saying get on the train, or?
Well, I'm saying
like the train's going,
saying,
leaving
look,
the station.
in life, everything is about choices, right? And you have choices to make. And if you choose not to, well, that of course is your right. You can decide to do whatever you think is right for your business. My view of that is that you're making a grave error of judgment if that's the path you choose to go on. And it won't necessarily be the case that your business will, you know, fall off the end of a cliff tomorrow morning. But over time, you will see your market share erode. I think you will find it harder to get people to come and work for you. I think you're going to find governments are going to have much more interventionist approaches to regulating you. Look, that's right. I you know, if I look at the good example of this is right now, governments are broke, right? They have just broken the bank.
That's right.
They have borrowed and borrowed and borrowed in order to get us to a place where at least we could keep the economy from completely imploding. Yes. Somehow they're going to have to pay for this.
That's
now,
right.
Inevitably, what I think is going to happen is that they're going to go and address they're going to use fiscal instruments where I think they're going to link it to things like environmental bans, you know, plastic taxes, packaging, you know, non-recyclable materials, or they're going to put a price on carbon. At some point, I can see this happening. And what will come out of that is, okay, if you have not invested in trying to decarbonize your business now, because it takes time, right? In 3 to 5 years' time, you will be unable to do much about it at that point in your future. That's right. And therefore you'll be paying for it in heightened amounts of tax. Those that are doing it now will reap a benefit because their business model will be more resistant and will be able to weather that storm and benefit from it in some ways. So that's what I mean. I mean, some of these decisions it's not all about making the decisions that are going to help you win now. It's about making the decisions that are going to enable you to win now and win later.
Beautiful. Beautifully said. And it's a really important message. And thank you for all the work that you're doing towards this. And really looking forward to hopefully collaborating with you more. And thanks for getting the message out. We need more leaders like you stepping forward, you know. And as I said, leadership is not about you being perfect. It's about being courageous and vulnerable and saying, hey, we're going to start and we're going to do our bit. So thank you for your time today. I love the conversation. And really excited to see the future and see where the new Reckitt brand's going to be in a few years.
Oh my. Thank you.
All right. Bless you. Take care. Bye.